It was unusual, but it's happened before. For example, we saw after Russia's failures in the north of Ukraine in the spring, a similarly staged conference among senior Russian commanders announcing that they would henceforth be focusing on the east in the Donbass region. Of course, we now know that that went no more successfully than the offensive in the north. But they seem to be staging some of these announcements. And while some people think the reason is that it's a ruse, there is trickery involved, maskirovka in the Russian word involving military deception, I think the explanation is more prosaic. I think it's fundamentally about the fact that they want to sell this decision, quite a painful decision from a Russian perspective, to the Russian people. And so it helps if you have a commander like Sergei Surovikin, this very sort of macho looking, beefy, stocky general who has been put in charge of the Russian war effort, talking to Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, explaining why this is a wise, sensible, rational military choice. I think there's a bit of salesmanship going on here.
Yeah. And when we saw that major Moscow's commander on the ground, as you point out, and, you know, it's not been that long since he was appointed in the hope of turning around this conflict for Russia. He said it wasn't possible to continue because of supplying, I would imagine, food, weaponry to the southern city. Does this talk to the lack of preparedness for the war and also Ukraine's resistance?
I think at this stage, it's no longer about preparedness. We are 8 months into this campaign. Preparedness is what partly doomed the Russian efforts in the first weeks and month of the campaign. But they've had 8 months, and so we can no longer blame this on poor pre-war decision-making or the bungling of intelligence agencies or the lack of time and consideration given to Russian military planners. This is about Ukrainian resistance. It's also about the geography of Kherson, right? Kherson is, as I think many of your viewers will now be familiar, on the west bank. The city is on the west bank of the Dnipro or the Dnieper River, and it's not easy to resupply Russian forces, about 30,000 Russian forces, over 30,000 at the peak of the campaign, from a very small number of bridges that were being repeatedly struck by Ukraine's use of long-range US-supplied rocket artillery. And so any armed force would have found it difficult to maintain such a position marooned on the other side of the river. And I think it is important to note, although this is a humiliation for Russia, the result is going to be, if they can pull off the withdrawal, that is, more defensible and rational front lines.
So then let's talk to this. The US General Mark Milley has been talking about some of the casualties numbers, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But he's also said that this is importantly a point that is cause for negotiation. Could it be, or is there still some disconnect between what Vladimir Putin wants and what his generals are able to accomplish on the ground?
Oh, undoubtedly so. Putin has annexed, as we know, 4 Ukrainian provinces, which include territory he didn't control when he annexed them, and they have shrunk. They have since shrunk. He has lost territory, albeit very small amounts, in Luhansk province in the east of Ukraine, as we know, and he's now lost a significant part of Kherson, which he declared to be an inalienable part of Russia a month ago. So, of course, his political objectives are completely out of sync with his military ones. But I think there's a longer-term calculation here on both sides. The Ukrainians feel that momentum is with them and that the Russian lines are collapsing over the winter period and that the morale is low, that these recruits don't want to fight, that Russia is showing military ineptitude, and that they can take back a lot of the territory they have lost since February 24th. But the Russians believe, not entirely without some basis, that by mobilizing these several 100,000 troops that they've done, that they can begin to stabilize the lines now that they've jettisoned the more vulnerable part, and perhaps even go on the offensive in the spring. So for now, neither side feels it is losing this campaign. Both sides still feel they have something to gain by fighting on.
But disappointingly, it means that there perhaps won't be that negotiation or conciliation that Mark Milley talks about, and it could continue to drag on.
It will, but we have to distinguish, as you've just done, between negotiation and a deal, between an actual settlement. I think one of the reasons the Americans are pressing the Ukrainians to talk is so that it doesn't look to Europeans, but also to the global South, to the Indians, the Chinese, the Brazilians, the Mexicans, that Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president, is being recalcitrant, that he's the obstacle to peace. They want to make sure that people know he is willing to talk, but that the Russians are not willing to withdraw, to give him what he really wants. I think the other reason is that the Americans may be doubtful about the Ukrainians' long-term ability to significantly take back territory. I'm more optimistic, but I think it is notable that the Americans are striking a slightly more gloomy note.
And particularly after the midterms, where there's no guarantee the levels of support can be guaranteed if they don't control Congress.
Well, you're right, but I think overall the Russians will be disappointed with the outcome of the midterms. Now, as we all know, there was no red wave, there was no Republican tidal wave that swept Democrats from office. The Senate is looking extremely finely balanced at this stage. The House has not tipped by as much as feared. And so if the Russians were hoping that the Republicans would simply collapse the Democratic position in Congress and then block arms flows, I think that's profoundly mistaken. Yes, the political tide is turning. Yes, the prospect of a victory of Donald Trump or a comparable populist figure like Ron DeSantis in 2024 may give the Kremlin pause to think, if we can stay in the war until then, that will then choke off Ukraine in 2024. We just have to stay in it. But the midterms will be a disappointment because this is going to mean armed support to Ukraine is going to continue into next year. And that's going to be a big, big challenge for the Russians.
Yeah. And just finally, as I mentioned earlier, those casualty numbers, 100,000 on both sides, that is devastating if those numbers are correct.
They are. These are huge, huge figures, far exceeding, the tallies of recent Russian campaigns. And indeed, I think the interesting thing is not just that the Russians have lost a lot of people, maybe 30,000 killed and overall 100,000 wounded and killed in total. But the important thing, that the point that Millie was making, Bev, was that Ukraine has also lost that many, a much smaller country than Russia. And I think that is what really shows, what a huge problem this will also be for them to find trained officers, trained men, and continue to churn out the manpower required to push back against Russia's mobilized strength.
Yeah, such a good point. Great to talk, Shashank. Thanks so much.
Thank you.